Hi all, I thought we'd do a beginner-oriented video today looking at the top 6 mistakes beginners tend to do, which it is possible to do something about. The first mistake is not really respecting or understanding the center. So the center of the chessboard, these 4 key squares, are very important. The center is like the hill in a battlefield. You can look at the opponent's army, you have great flexibility. Pieces in the center, for example, a knight here or a knight here. A knight here would only control 1 square, 2 squares. A knight in the center, put a knight in the center, and all of a sudden a knight is controlling 8 squares, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you can see pieces in the center become more valuable generally, especially knights. So beginners tend to play moves, for example, like h4 or a4. So let's see, so a4, which doesn't really do anything for the center, or h4. If you contrast this with 2 very, very good moves, e4 or d4, you're actually controlling central squares. So for example, e4 controls that d5 square. It also opens up this bishop, which can in turn control and cut across central squares potentially. And the knight can also come to f3. It's better to move the knight to f3, which controls central squares, rather than say on the rim, which is often called dim, because it's not as useful generally speaking. So the center is really vitally important. And so the 2 most common popular moves generally in chess are e4 and d4, but sometimes also c4 is played, which is again looking at d5. It is looking at a central square, but d4 and e4 remain the most popular. So respecting the center is something that can be easily achieved by arranging your pieces in alignment with those central squares. So that's the first kind of mistake beginners in chess kind of make. The second one is not really understanding castling, the castling rule, and king safety in general. The king is the most valuable piece, and a typical game, generally you want to castle quickly. So for example, if we start off with e4 and the opponent plays e5, this could be an example game where here you have an opportunity to castle. You need to move the king first 2 squares, not the rook, because this could be treated as a legal move in its own right, and the opponent could claim you played that. So when you actually play the castling move, you need to actually move the king first. So say we have this position. You move the king first 2 squares and then the rook after. So castling puts the king in a safer spot. The rook is also prepared to come to the center now as well. You can see that the rook's ready to go to e1. So it activates the rook. Otherwise the rooks are often left on a1 and h1. So it also brings the rooks to the center more quickly. So castling is a really important thing, but so is generally king safety in general. Checkmating the king is the objective of the game. And as you get stronger, there are more and more sophisticated ways of winning games. But generally speaking, checkmate ends the game. So you have to be aware of this special castling move. And if you want to castle on the queen side, let's say from this example, we want to move on the queen side. We could make a provision for doing that. Say black castles over there. And later, you can, for example, do this. And the king, it still moves 2 squares. So you'd move the king first, 2 squares, and the rook goes across. So castling is vital to know about. So that's number 2. Number 3 is too many beginners are too keen to checkmate too quickly. So we get a lot of games in beginner games like this, where in fact, say bishop c4, looking at this soft spot, there's too much of an eagerness, especially if the opponent is playing a move like this and doesn't play knight f6. There's an eagerness to play queen h5, for example, looking at f7, hoping for a very quick win, which brings instant gratification. If the opponent plays this, then it's checkmate, and that is a good demonstration of the coordination of pieces. but the opponent had stronger moves here and could have repulsed the queen to go back, and you could try again, but you've basically ended up wasting time. And worse, the opponent could gain a tempo by hitting your queen, and you're driven back quite often. Otherwise you're going to lose c2 and lose the rook. So you end up losing a lot of development as your attack is repulsed. So queen h5, bringing out the queen too early, is not to be recommended. Instead, just play moves which increase your development of pieces, for example like this, and you have a safe, solid position. So bringing out the queen too early like this, let me just show this again. So you eye like this. Now knight f6, also you could, given you can't play this because of taking, you might think this, but again you would have to cover d4, and it's not totally ideal there on f3. It can still be subject to tempo gains. For example, black might play bishop g4 at some point, and it's not entirely ideal. Although it's not entirely lost either. It's not the sort of thing you really want to do. Bring out the queen early for an early checkmate. Okay, another beginner trend is playing a little bit too stodgy against everything. So an example of extreme stodginess is this. You play this, and you play this, and then the stodgy move knight c3. The problem with this, it's not really liberating the pieces. This kind of move can result in a super stodgy position, which is lacking too much interest, really, or much interest in terms of piece activity and open lines. Sometimes the pawns, you want to use the pawns to get aggressive scope for your pieces. So, for example, after bishop c5, castling, knight f6, you might want to consider a plan, for example, c3 and then d4. And what's happening here is you're also sometimes getting better central control than the opponent and pushing the opponent back. And you can see that the pieces, by contrast, they're not as hemmed in. So piece liberation, not playing too stodgy, is actually something which happens over and over again in beginning games, because not looking at how pawns can really make the position more fun and exciting, liberating the pieces. So try and avoid perhaps sometimes this overly stodgy move knight c3. c3 sometimes for d4 is a common plan in any case, and it opens up the position more potentially. So playing too stodgily over and over again is a bad symptom of something. But also against anything, this setup is often played. So even against the Sicilian defense, we have this kind of stodginess, bishop c4. And the problem is here, the opponent could blunt that bishop and just get a very, very easy to play position later, with the bishop being a potential target. So for example, say we had this position where black plays d5, and the bishop, say it has to drop back, and you played this, and now all of a sudden black's more than fully equalized. This is a nasty pin, and you don't really want to weaken your king position kicking this bishop away. The opponent's got knight d4 coming, so this is already fantastic for black. And what you've done, you've essentially played in a stodgy manner as you would with against any other opening, not realizing that actually, you know, this bishop could be just blunted quite easily. So the relationship of the pawns and the pieces are something to bear in mind early on, really, how the pieces can be liberated and made more fun and exciting by the pawn structures, and not to play overly stodgy. So another common mistake beginners make is having undefended pieces. So undefended pieces, especially in a continual manner, represent tactical liabilities. So just to show, for example, if you have a bishop on c4 and you don't really defend it, let's see, it can become a tactical liability later. So say the bishop, it remains undefended here, and maybe you even put it there, and then you do something silly like move the knight. They're the ones that are most likely to fall off because they're not defended. And a lot of tactics are related to undefended pieces, simply material just dropping off. So when you have undefended pieces, they are tactical liabilities. Okay, and the last common mistake is pushing too many pawns in the opening. You might be overindulgent in pawn moves and play like, for example, like this, where you're moving too many pawns and you're leaving pawns hanging. so if you do this, this is not very good, generally speaking, although sometimes it can be quite aggressive. If you end up, say, moving this pawn, then it can just be taken, and then basically you'll just material down for not too much. And if you play like this, you're blocking in that rook instead of opening lines. So one of the great advantages, if you are going to move pawns aggressively, is to try and open lines for your pieces, not keep them hemmed in. So basically, yeah, try and avoid moving too many pawns. Pawns really by nature, they don't go backwards. Whenever you do a pawn move, unlike the other pieces, you can't ever retract that pawn move. So it's really creating weaknesses as well behind it. You can't, like other pieces, for example, say the knight moved here. This is not a particularly great move, but say the knight moved here and black changed mind, and this would be a silly thing to do, but the knight could go back, but you can't move this pawn back. Pawns by nature, once they move, they cannot go back, unlike the other pieces, so they're pretty committal. And so they reflect the concept of very committal decisions, which in general you should be aware of, that when you play your pawns, play them carefully, not to create too many weaknesses. So for example, a more sensible sequence here, let's go with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. So we played c4, we're weakening d4, and black could try and use this later, for example like this. We see that these pawns are never going back, and they've kind of weakened that d4 square. And basically, say you did this as well, and this, and you've weakened that d4 square, and potentially it could be useful for black. So when you have structures like this that you create with the pawns, you're creating weaknesses. So here, you know, b4 and d4 are kind of weak squares. So be aware of the commitments you make when you move pawns. So that's kind of the sixth major thing I would say as a common beginner mistake. So I hope you got something out of this. Please leave any comments or questions in the video. Thanks so much.